Hey, a minority of people watching this channel will be aware that I have a background for more than 10 years as a scholar of Buddhism. If you put my name into Google, still many of the search results relate to that personal history I've had, because people are still searching for that stuff. People are still downloading links and articles that are on the internet from that time in my life. And one of the questions I've been asked most broadly overall is, what is the future of Buddhism? Normally people are asking it in a kind of broad, hypothetical, global sense. And they're not asking in a hands-on, human-scale sense of what can you do, what can I do, what can we do for the future of Buddhism. Now, I should add here the disclaimer. I myself am not a Buddhist. I openly identify as an ex-Buddhist and as a nihilist. I identify with a philosophy of historical nihilism, for what that's worth. I could do a separate video talking about exactly what that's worth. However, I understand that a small number of people are still really interested in what I have to say under this heading because of the depth and the breadth of my experience. I was asked in a conversation just today about what Judaism meant to me and what kind of participation in the Jewish community I had in my adult life, and I had to say none at all. I've been living in places like China and Cambodia, Laos, been living in Southeast Asia, and even here in Canada. My adult life has had almost nothing to do with Judaism, and it's had a lot to do with Buddhism in its institutional and historical reality, as well as on the side of scholarship, research, and what have you. I've also had discussions lately with professors here. I am going to answer this question about the future of Buddhism, but this video is also partly about me. It's not just about Buddhism, it's about me and what I have to say about Buddhism. Naturally or inevitably, I guess. While I am an ex-Buddhist, one of my professors here is a specialist in the South Pacific, so small island societies like Tonga, Fiji, Samoa. And in talking about both the indigenous religions there and in the total obliteration of the native culture by Christianity on those islands, I'm reminded of the comparison to Buddhism. And I can, in a very real sense, there's always a question of better and worse with these things. Although I do not believe in any of the supernatural elements of Buddhism, and I never did. I never believed in supernatural Buddhism. Nevertheless, in looking at these islands that are in Asia, these small island societies, but have really been cut off from Buddhism historically, and now are, captured by basically British Christianity. Of course, you can't help but feel that they would be better off if they had been part of the Buddhist world rather than being isolated from it and then colonized by Europeans in this way. And even within Southeast Asia, we had in front of my eyes ongoing at that time the historical experience of indigenous animist peoples, people who had never been Buddhist, who practiced traditional spirit worshipping religions, converting to Buddhism for the first time. And in other cases, tribal peoples were converting to Christianity. Now, of course, many anthropologists would be upset to hear any discussion of these things at all and feel that, the native culture is being destroyed or disappearing when people are making the choice as rational adults to convert to Buddhism. However, living there, seeing the reality face to face, and dealing with the extreme brutality just of animal sacrifice, again, one can't help feeling sympathetically that these people would indeed be better off involved with Buddhism, even if you regard all of the supernatural elements as bullshit. I remember learning in depth about one particular tribal group, and their chieftain, their tribal leader, decided he was fed up with their indigenous tradition and that they should convert to Theravada Buddhism, partly because he said, look, this animal sacrifice, it's madness, and it's keeping us all locked in poverty. His particular group, their religious and social life centered around sacrificing water buffalo, and cows. So they were always bankrupting themselves. These are poor people in a third world country buying and killing these animals for magical reasons. And of course raising them and so on. There are other groups there indigenous to that same area whose whole religious life centers around sacrificing chickens, ritual slaughter of chickens, including torturing the chickens to death in some pretty gruesome ways, cutting the heads off chickens, and I don't want to get into the details. In that religious context, where on the one hand you have sort of the brutality of animism, and on the other hand you have the encroachment from Christian missionaries all around, it's very easy to be pro-Buddhist, not even in the historical past, in the historical present, talking about a current ongoing process of cultural transformation, even with the considerable caveat that I regard the supernatural claims of Buddhism as completely false. So you can see why I've inserted this series of caveats as a introduction to this topic. Now, in the 21st century, looking ahead to the 22nd century, what legitimacy can Buddhism have? I'll repeat that. What legitimacy can Buddhism have now and in the future? I think there are two broad categories under which I'd speak positively about the future of Buddhism, and then some notes negatively. Positively speaking, we have to be looking at, on the one hand, scholarship, and on the other hand, community service. I don't know. I mean, I've had so many experiences with these kind of very cynical Westerners who think they're idealistic, but who really believe in a highly manipulated and insincere form of Buddhism, criticizing me. And these people, white Western Buddhists, tend to assume that my engagement with the religion was purely rational, purely archaeological. And on the contrary, as a character, I have always really appreciated that, for example, people need funeral rituals. I think, funeral rituals are quite meaningful. Again, with no supernatural beliefs whatsoever. I don't think anything magical happens at your funeral, but as a social event to bring people together to mourn the dead and perform some kind of ritual for the dead, I think that is meaningful. This type of social function of Buddhism really is important and significant, and it's worth looking at critically. What is the status of it now in the 21st century? Problematic at best, no matter where you are in the world. Now, beyond that, if you've watched this channel at all, you'll know that I also have an engagement with charity work. Talking about social services. Are you talking about feeding the poor, giving out sacks of rice to starving people? Are you talking about caring for orphans? Are you talking about interventions in disaster areas? In these areas, Buddhism is the weakest religion in the world. If you want a career in disaster relief services, humanitarian work of any kind, you're almost compelled to be Christian. The whole field is completely dominated by Christianity, and it's not a simple matter of economics. Anytime there's an earthquake or there's a disaster, there are basically one or two very small, very vocal Buddhist charities based in Taiwan that try to show up and symbolically represent Buddhism, but it's a drop in the bucket. And within China is a communist country, and also within Thailand is a Buddhist majority country where Buddhism is the official state religion, the official religion of the monarchy, and so on. But within both China and Thailand, these types of humanitarian services are completely dominated by Christian missionaries. It's not easy for Christian missionaries to operate in either of these countries. There are, restrictions on them. And they've been tremendously successful exactly where Buddhism has been a failure. So there's a question of, can you build a constituency for Buddhism? Can Buddhism have a future rooted in, on the one hand, scholarly legitimacy, and on the other hand, social services legitimacy? And can you have a dynamic connection between the two of those? Now, again, in terms of scholarly legitimacy, some people take a very uncharitable set of assumptions that I'm interested in incredibly obtuse and irrelevant details of textual scholarship that will never influence the lives of ordinary Buddhists. And nothing could be further from the truth. When I talk about how scholarship matters in terms of a religion as it exists today, firstly, you have to understand Buddhism today is so corrupt and has been led by people who are sincerely ignorant of the textual and philosophical basis of Buddhism for so long that I have a book here I'd like to grab. It's just out of sight. I have an autobiography of a Buddhist monk on my desk here somewhere that I was going to hold up as an example. The Buddhist monk in that book, his whole life was defined by being a refugee. World War II and the Communist Revolution in China completely shaped his life, and he spent his life running away from that. And you can really understand why he was basically in a struggle to try to sort of preserve the ignorance of his own grandparents in terms of traditional village Buddhism in China. And he never developed the type of scholarly awareness of the history of Buddhism or Buddhist philosophy or Buddhist texts that even I did, let alone some greater expert. So it is not without sympathy for people that I talk about ignorance. But on the other hand, a lot of what you're looking at in Buddhism, including that monk whose biography I have right here somewhere, a lot of the ignorance is at the level of a Christian telling you that their faith is based on a dialogue between Santa Claus and Jesus, or between Santa Claus and Moses. And you have to say, wait a minute, I've read the Bible. Those two people never met. Like, Santa Claus isn't in the Bible at all. Like, what are you talking about? It's no joke. I mean, the blind leading the blind has gone a long, long way in Buddhism in the past 100 years, but in the past 1,000 years also. And the natural check on that tendency can only be legitimate scholarship. Now, legitimate scholarship also turns up things of real philosophical interest and of real literary value. The legitimacy of Buddhism cannot rest on false supernatural promises that are equivalent to prayer in other religions. It can rest on people really seeing value in philosophical literature and cultural heritage that contains outlandish and mythological elements, but also has elements that are at least rewarding to read and engage with in the same way that Shakespeare is. You know, the value of Shakespeare's Hamlet does not rest on its historical accuracy. If somebody discovers new evidence about what really happened to a certain prince, in an obscure prince in the history of Europe, nobody would say, well, Shakespeare's Hamlet is worthless because it's been proven to be historically false or inaccurate. Same is true even Shakespeare's plays about historical kings within England, or Two Gentlemen of Verona or something. None of this stuff is valuable culturally, morally, ethically even. You know, people feel they're being uplifted by educating themselves in Shakespeare. They want to educate their children in Shakespeare so that they'll be good people in some sense. I mean, there is an ethical component to why we study and teach literature, especially with what's considered high or refined literature in this way. It has nothing to really do with truth claims, and it definitely has nothing to do with supernatural claims of efficacy. But again, today the reality is Buddhism has really bottomed out in both of these things. Believe me, very few people alive have visited as many Buddhist universities as I have, and have spoken to as many experts to figure out if there was anywhere in any Buddhist monastery or any university anywhere in the world that you could legitimately make progress in the scholarship of Buddhist texts. And the short answer is, for me, for my generation, no, there's really nowhere. And if you're thinking about telling me about some exception, Let me tell you, I've probably looked into it. I've probably talked to some people off the record and found out that that exception to the rule is not an exception to the rule. It's a tremendously dark time right now, in the 21st century, for Buddhism. And I think it'll never recover. I mean, I'm being honest with you. In that sense, if you want to talk to me about the future of Buddhism, I can give an answer that's not snarky at all and say there is no future. Because I neither believe that within my lifetime, Buddhism will recover legitimacy in terms of social services, nor in terms of scholarship. Those are the positive side of this video. The negative side is, in terms of the core tenets of Buddhism, many of the supernatural elements people can lose faith in without discarding their religion. Many Buddhists talk about the fact that you don't need to believe in reincarnation to be a Buddhist. This is true. However, the truth claims surrounding meditation and surrounding nirvana, strictly defined, that is a challenge to most people's faith and to how they think about the future of the religion. I can remember reading, and again, I'm really a fan of, authentic village Buddhism. I'm not a fan of just hanging out in the library or the archives. My approach to Buddhism was not strictly archaeological. I remember reading about a traditional Buddhist preacher in the small villages of Myanmar, aka Burma, went from town to town in Myanmar, preaching more or less the same thing for decades of his life. And, one of his great choruses, one of the things he returned to thematically, he would always emphasize to people they should not be trying to go to heaven after they die. They should not be trying to just get a good reincarnation, and they should not be worshiping gods. They should instead be focused on achieving nirvana and on doing good deeds and being good people in order to achieve nirvana in this lifetime, which is quite a rousing and uplifting approach to take, actually, if you know about Buddhism. The vast majority of Buddhist monks do not have the nerve to suggest such a thing, especially not to sort of common peasants in a small village. Instead, they tend to conservatively say, don't worry too much about nirvana, and let's not talk about nirvana because it's pretty philosophically difficult. This guy was saying, no, philosophy is for everybody. Nirvana is for everybody. Well, both as a weakness and a strength. As a challenge to Buddhism now, I think you have to look at a sort of progress that will come from acknowledging that nirvana is just a philosophical concept. And like many philosophical concepts in the Pali canon, in the Theravada written works that preserve the philosophy of Buddhism, it is interesting, and it is even more interesting when you examine it in its real culture, the cultural context it originated from in ancient India. It's still interesting today. Unlike Christian philosophy, God, who wants to read St. Augustine? The vast majority of Christian philosophy is very difficult to get anyone interested in. The Buddhist philosophy is interesting. So again, this is strength, not a weakness. But you have to really just admit that nirvana is only a philosophical concept, that both the modern assumptions about meditation and the ancient assumption about meditation are supernatural mythology, and in a simple sense, they are false. I still do not see that as a reason for Buddhism to cease to exist as a religion, though. If you look at the founding of Reform Judaism started off with a charter or a constitution. It refers to the God idea. And it's actually pretty obvious, if you read that charter, that constitution, that the people founding this new form of Judaism, Reform Judaism, they did not, in a conventional sense, believe in God, or at any rate, they wanted to create a version of Judaism that was open to and accepting of atheists, to be frank. I do not think that Judaism holds up as a religion if you switch from God to the God idea. I think it falls apart. I mean, if we're being honest, you can read the whole Bible and you tell me, if God doesn't exist, how much real value is there in this religious tradition? But I actually do not think Buddhism is in a similar corner. I think that you can replace nirvana with the nirvana idea. You can look at that stuff as philosophy, and like ancient Greek philosophy, It's a philosophy that reflects the cultural context it originated in. It reflects the other religions it was competing with at that time in India, especially Hinduism and Jainism, but other religions that have completely disappeared, ancient religions of India that don't exist anymore. And it can be meaningful in its own way. But yes, at some point, the snake oil salesman side of Buddhism would have to stop for the religion to have a future of any kind. You'd have to stop selling people the illusion that they can be happier, healthier, earn more money if they just close their eyes and perform a breathing exercise that is based on a horrendous mistranslation of a completely irrelevant ancient text. And you have to stop pretending that a form of monastic discipline that was absolutely meant for people living in celibacy and living as beggars, living with a literal begging bowl, that discipline can somehow be part of your sexy, urban, jet-setting 21st century life as a bourgeois executive or, Buddhism was not designed to be among the accoutrements of a hedonistic, indulgent lifestyle. Now, the philosophy of Aristotle was. I mean, there were other ancient philosophies that actually fit in pretty well with a lifestyle of even aristocratic self-indulgence, let alone bourgeois self-indulgence. But again, it's significant that Buddhism, as a philosophy, as a religion, as a cultural tradition, still has a lot to offer, even with all these caveats, even with all these aspects taken away. And I can't say that about Aristotle. I've read a ton of Aristotle, in all honesty. The potential is not there for Aristotle to have a positive contribution in the 21st century. I don't feel that way about Judaism, nor Christianity, nor Islam. I really do not think those religions have something positive to offer in the 21st century, and they have a lot negative to offer. And again, if you have a friend, someone you care about personally, who was actually practicing animal sacrifice in a form of animism, you would be so happy for them if they got interested in, shall we say, the civilizing effects of Buddhism as a religion. And if I had a friend, someone I cared about personally, who was practicing Islam, practicing Protestant Christianity, and they told me, I'm going to give it up because I'm really into this philosophy called Buddhism that teaches there is no soul, to live is to suffer, and everything is impermanent. Pretty strong start to a popular philosophy in the 21st century. If I had a friend who came to me and told me that, I'd say, wow, I'm so happy for you. Even though, as I said, I don't believe in reincarnation, and I don't believe in any of the promises that get made by meditation salesmen.